He was Hollywood's leading man, charming, bold, unforgettable. Glenn Ford ruled the silver screen for decades, starring alongside legends like Marlon Brando and Bette Davis. But behind the spotlight, behind the fame and the flawless smile, lived a man tormented by silence, regret, and love unfulfilled. He loved one woman his entire life, yet never married her. He had a son, but abandoned him for nearly 50 years. And in the end, it wasn't the roles he played that defined him, it was the secrets he never spoke of. This is the side of Glenn Ford the world was never supposed to see. He married 4 times, had affairs with hundreds of Hollywood stars, yet in the end, Glenn Ford lay alone in a hospital bed, a nurse quietly preparing a do not resuscitate order. His only son had to fight in court just to keep him alive. This was the tragic final chapter of a man who once ruled the silver screen in classics like Gilda, The Big Heat, and Blackboard Jungle. Glenn Ford wasn't a monster, but he wasn't the man anyone dreamed of as a father, husband, or lifelong partner. He lived in contradiction, adored by millions, yet emotionally distant from the people who needed him most. And it was that very conflict, the fame, the silence, the irreversible choices, that made him one of the most complex and quietly devastating figures in Hollywood history. Born on May 1, 1916, in Port-Neuf, Quebec, he carried a name as weighty as his legacy, Gwilyn Samuel Newton Ford. His bloodline was extraordinary, one side linked to Canada's first Prime Minister, the other descending from U.S. President Martin Van Buren. From the moment he entered the world, Glenn stood between 2 destinies, one of heritage and status, and another of escape, ambition, and cinematic immortality. When Glenn was just 8 years old, his family left behind the chill of Canada for the golden promise of Santa Monica, California, a move that would change the course of his destiny. Under the glow of the Pacific sun, a young boy quietly discovered the stage at Santa Monica High School. It was there, performing in modest school plays, that Glenn first felt the seductive power of transformation, the thrill of becoming someone else. And maybe, just maybe, that's when he also learned how to start hiding who he really was. After graduating in 1934, Glenn threw himself into the grind of local theater across the West Coast. He had no name, no money, just calloused hands and a relentless drive. By day, he worked with wood, wires, and steel, as an electrician, a construction hand, a carpenter, fixing up the family home. His father, a strict railroad executive, reminded him constantly. You better learn a real trade, just in case Hollywood never calls. But what no one saw coming, was that Hollywood would call. Not for the real Glenn Ford, but for the illusion he so perfectly embodied. The strong, stoic, all-American leading man. A dream wrapped in celluloid. In 1937, he walked into 20th Century Fox with hope in his heart, and walked out with rejection. But Glenn was just getting started. And the man who once built homes with his hands was about to build a legend on screen. He failed again, but he didn't give up. Then came Columbia Pictures, which made Glenn Ford a star on the American movie screen. In 1939, Glenn Ford signed a long-term contract with Columbia Pictures. This was a bold but smart move by the studio's head, Harry Kahn. Instead of buying stars from other studios like he had done before, Kahn chose to develop Columbia's own generation of actors, and Glenn was chosen along with William Holden. Harry Kahn bluntly said, "One of them will make it, and the other will be eaten alive." What he didn't expect was that the two would become close friends and become famous together. Glenn's first leading role was in the movie Heaven with a Barbed Wire Fence, but it wasn't a smooth start. Director Ricardo Cortez called him a lousy actor on set and swore he would never work with him again. Years later, Glenn ran into him at a restaurant and almost punched him, but Hollywood is a place where one can forgive. A big break can change everything, and for Glenn Ford, it happened in 1946 when he and Rita Worth became famous in the movie Gilda. Rita was the sex icon of her time, and Glenn's quiet, understated style was the perfect balance to her. While most of the attention was on Rita, Glenn's performance left a lasting impression on audiences, and from that movie on, the two began a relationship that was confusing and haunting that would last for 40 years after Gilda Glenn's career took off. In 1953, he played a noir detective in The Big Heat, for which he was nominated for an Oscar. In 1955, he played a teacher in A Chaotic School with Sidney Poitier, creating the genre of educational dramas. In 1956, he co-starred with Marlon Brando in Tea House of the August Moon, a satirical comedy. In 1957, he played a cowboy in 3:10 to Yuma, proving his skill as a Western actor thanks to real-life skills in horseback riding and shooting. In 1958, Ford became the biggest box office star in America, an honor that he had avoided for a long time. Despite major scandals and always keeping a low-key, calm presence. The 1960s saw a range of films, but Glenn stuck with his roles in Cimarron, 1960, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, 1963, The Rounders, 1965, and Heaven with a Gun, 1969. As his success in movies began to fade, he moved to TV and continued to do well with shows like Cad's County, The Family HVAC, and Once an Eagle throughout the 1970s. His final and most moving movie cameo was in Jonathan. In Superman, the movie, 1978, Glenn played Kent, Superman's adoptive father, with just a look. He spoke to the audience's hearts with steadiness, grace, and quiet compassion. In his later years, he played a few small parts, like in Day of the Assassin, 1979, but everyone knew that Glenn Ford's golden age was over and that he had to deal with things like the woman he loved, the son he left behind, and the part of himself that he never fully forgave when the United States joined World War II. Many famous people chose to serve their country by buying war bonds or performing for the troops. Glenn Ford did the same thing until one day on the set of Destroyer 1943, he told the director, "I can't keep just playing a soldier." He then volunteered for the U.S. Marine Corps Reserve. This decision shocked Hollywood. Harry Kahn, the head of Columbia Pictures, was furious because he was in the middle of making Glenn the studio's biggest star, but Glenn chose to go because he wanted to be a soldier, not just pretend to be one on screen. Life didn't give him a full heroic arc. When he was sent to the Marine Corps' Public Relations Division, Glenn soon had serious health problems. Doctors found he had a duodenal ulcer, which caused him a lot of pain and kept him in the hospital for 5 months, making him unfit for deployment. For someone who really wanted to prove his worth, this was a silent disappointment he never talked about. After being discharged in 1944, he went back to work in movies, but even though he never saw combat, Glenn Ford always took. He was proud to have served, so he stayed in the Naval Reserve and eventually reached the rank of lieutenant commander. He was then given duties in military media and cultural outreach. Almost 50 years later, in 1992, Glenn was given the Legion of Honor by the French government, which is their highest honor for helping civilians fleeing the Nazis during the war not with a weapon but through his image, his spirit, and his commitment to justice through films, fundraising tours, and humanitarian work in the years after the war. Glenn Ford may not have fired a gun in battle, but he lived his whole life with the soldier's code, calm, responsible, and sometimes too alone to ask for help. While the military saw him as a dedicated serviceman, in his personal life he was a man who couldn't hold on to anyone. His glow made people admire him, but it also drove loved ones away, and that was the start of another tragedy that lasted longer and was deeper than any battlefield love marriage and a father-son bond that never really healed. Rita Worth was the beautiful young actress Glenn Ford's first co-star in the 1940 movie The Lady in Question. Neither of them was famous yet, they were just starting their careers. But there was something more than performance between them, a natural chemistry, a cinematic electricity that flickered in glances and lingered in silence on the screen. 6 years later, in 1946, when they reunited in Gilda, both had grown in talent and emotion. Gilda became legendary, and an unnamed love began between them. I never saw Gilda as a movie, it was a memory. Rita, who was famous and lonely, found in Glenn something she had always needed, quiet protection. But timing got in the way. When Glenn was single, Rita was married to Edward Judson. When Rita got divorced, Glenn had already married Ella Lehner Powell, and then she married Orson Welles and Prince Icon. Their schedules were always off, but they always found their way back to each other when Rita lived in Beverly Hills with her then-husband, screenwriter James Hill told Glenn that the land next door had just been put up for sale. Glenn didn't think twice, he bought it and built a new house right next to Rita's backyard wall. The next day, Rita filed for divorce. No one said a word, but everyone knew what was going on. Glenn put a small gate in the back fence so Rita could walk over whenever she wanted. They had breakfast together, sunbathed by Glenn's pool, and lived like secret lovers in the middle of Hollywood in 1972. Jokingly told the press, "Glenn is the best neighbor a woman could ask for." But behind that smile was a deeper truth: they were everything to each other but never truly each other. Over the years that followed, Glenn Ford had many other relationships, but he never forgot about Rita. He said that every movie she was in was one of his favorites and that he loved her deeply. By 1981, Rita started losing her memory, and doctors told her she had early-onset Alzheimer's. She was slowly forgetting who she was. Rita died in 1987 at the age of 68. Glenn was one of the pallbearers who walked slowly behind her coffin. He didn't say a word or cry, but everyone could tell that a silent ocean was breaking inside him. No one will ever know exactly what happened between them in those 40 years, they were never married and never lived together, but they were never really apart. Glenn once said in a documentary about Rita that a part of her will always live in him. Rita Hayworth's life, and to many, it was the most beautiful and sad love story Hollywood ever kept hidden. If Rita Hayworth was the woman Glenn Ford never married but loved with all his heart, then Ella Lehner Powell was the woman he married but never really loved the right way. In 1943, while Glenn was in the military, he met Eleanor, who was Hollywood's reigning queen of tap dance and had once wowed even her co-stars in MGM's grand musicals with her strength and grace. Glenn was still living with his mother, and Ella Lehner was still living with hers. After the wedding, they moved into a 22-room mansion in Beverly Hills, which was a symbol of Glenn's rise from the working class and also the place where Ella Lehner ended her artistic career at age 33, when she was at the height of her fame. She gave up the stage, the audience, and the applause to become Glenn Ford's wife and the mother of their only child, Peter, who was born in 1945. But Glenn was just starting to reach the top of his career, and her love wasn't enough for him. While Eleanor dedicated herself to her family, Glenn had a series of affairs with co-stars on set and short-lived romances. No one knows the exact number, but Peter Ford says his father recorded over 140 private conversations with Hollywood stars like Judy Garland, Marilyn Monroe, Joan Crawford, and Geraldine Brooks. There were no fights or public breakdowns, but what hurt Eleanor the most was the long, unexplained silence in the grand three-story house they lived in. Eleanor lived on the second floor and Glenn lived on the first. Their son Peter lived in the middle with his grandmother Hannah. Even though they all lived in the same house, none of them interacted with the other two. Peter would later say, "My father didn't hug me or talk to my mother. He just showed up when he had to and then disappeared." After 16 years of a marriage that wasn't really a marriage, Ella Lehner quietly asked for a divorce in 1959, just as Peter turned 14. Glenn signed the papers without protest, and Ella Lehner took her son with her, but never the heart of the man she had given up the world for. For the next 23 years, Ella Lehner never married again, raised her son, and did religious work, as if the rest of her life was spent making up for a love that came at the wrong time with the wrong person. When she died of cancer in 1982, her ashes were buried in a simple brass urn at Hollywood Forever Cemetery. There was no big ceremony, and only Peter, the boy she once called the only reason to keep going, was there. Glenn didn't go to the funeral. He may have been too busy or didn't know how to handle it. Of the hundreds of women who had been in Glenn Ford's life, only one child bore his name. That child, Peter Newton Ford, grew up in a home where his father was barely there after Eleanor Powell filed for divorce. She filed for divorce in 1959 and was given custody. Glenn didn't argue, but he also didn't stay in touch during Peter's formative years. Glenn wasn't around at all, no letters, calls, or advice when his son first met the world. Peter once said, "He was my father biologically, but he wasn't there." Glenn sent a small monthly support check, just enough to avoid being called irresponsible, but never enough to fill the void of an empty childhood while he was away. Peter lived with his mother and grandmother in a house where the past never really went away. It was even worse that Glenn and Peter worked together a lot, especially on the TV show Cad's County in the 1970s, but on set they were more like strangers than co-workers, no hugs, no shared meals after filming, and not even a proud look from a father to his son. But time did what it could not stop. Glenn got old, and after a series of strokes, he lost the ability to walk, his memory started to fade, he needed a wheelchair, and became totally dependent on others. It was during this time that he called Peter back, not as a son, but as someone he needed help from. They were back under one roof, with no more separate floors. Just a broken father and a son trying to make sense of his life while hearing the sound of medical machines and remembering bits and pieces. Peter started asking Glenn stories that no one had heard about affairs, long-hidden fears, and life. He lived a full life but never told the one person who called him Dad the truth. In a later interview, Peter said, "For the first time, my father looked at me for a long time and then said, 'Do you remember when you were little?' That's when I knew he was trying to make things right, late but sincere." After Glenn's death, Peter wrote the memoir Glenn Ford, A Life 2011, not to blame or get revenge, but to tell the story his father had chosen to keep hidden his whole life, a man who was once admired by everyone. In the end, he could only ask the son he had left behind to write for him 2 words he could never say himself. At the height of his fame, Glenn Ford was a man that Hollywood respected, but in his later years, he was not the same Glenn Ford that people knew. He had lost his steady gaze, his upright posture, his sharp memory, and his warm, grounded smile. After turning 70, Glenn started having a series of strokes, each one worse than the last. His nervous system started to break down, and his memory began to fade. Once a man who strode confidently across movie sets, he was now in a wheelchair and completely dependent on others. At this point, Glenn wasn't living with his son, but with Pauline Kernan, a much younger private nurse hired for full-time care. But things quickly turned suspicious. According to Peter Ford, Glenn's father had updated his will to leave most of his estate to Pauline, leaving out almost all of his family. The breaking point came when Pauline had put a "do not resuscitate" (DNR) order outside of Glenn's hospital room, even though Glenn was still conscious, could communicate, and clearly wanted to live. Peter had to go to court, not to fight over money, but to fight for his father's right to stay alive. After the hearing, the DNR order was revoked, care terms were changed, and Pauline was removed as Glenn's medical proxy. It wasn't just a legal battle, it was the last face-to-face between a son and the looming shadow of a father who had been emotionally distant his whole life. Glenn asked Peter and his family to move in with him after the ordeal. At that point, he wasn't a movie star, a charming lover, or a neglectful father, he was just an old man clinging to what little was left in the one embrace that had finally opened for him. Glenn lived a few more years in silence. He stopped acting, giving interviews, and writing in the Beverly Hills home that had been a sanctuary of love with Rita and a soundtrack for Peter's childhood laughter. At 4 p.m. on August 30, 2006, Glenn Ford died quietly. He was 90 years old. There was no big funeral or Hollywood farewell. Instead, he asked that the ashes of his beloved dog Bismar, the loyal four-legged companion who had always slept by his bedside, be buried with him at Woodland Cemetery in Santa Monica. It was a peaceful but sad ending because to the public he would always be a symbol, but to him his whole life may have been a long search for one. Glenn Ford never made a lot of noise as a star. He could forgive the women he loved, the son he left behind, and the man he never fully made peace with. He didn't act with grand gestures, didn't wave his arms on display, and didn't play the exposure recreation in actual existence, and it changed into exactly because of that Glenn became the sort of actor a whole era of American audiences once trusted, empathized with, and noticed as a reflection of themselves. He performed the instructor in Blackboard Jungle, the cop inside the large warmth, the Western farmer in Cowboy, the father in Superman. In every role he did not overwhelm the target market, he made them experience close, secure and quietly heartbroken when he failed. Critics once referred to as Glenn Ford the ordinary man. In extraordinary instances he wasn't Clark Gable nor become he Marlon Brando or James Dean, however he became Glenn Ford, the scene accomplice all of us desired to work with, the form of man every viewer believed was actual over a profession that spanned extra than 50 years. Glenn Ford starred in over 100 films across nearly every genre: film noir, Gilda, the big heat social drama Blackboard Jungle, The Doctor and the Lady, westerns 3:10 to Yuma, The Fastest Gun Alive, Jubal comedies, The Tea House of the August Moon, The Courtship of Eddie's Father, and even superhero movies. Superman the film 1978. In 1958 he was the #1 container workplace megastar in the USA title few actors held for greater than a year. He held it for 4, but the sour fact isn't many consider Glenn Ford. Nowadays there's no towering tribute on Hollywood street. No grand memorial after his death, no revival campaigns for his conventional films like those dedicated to Humphrey Bogart or John Wayne. In a single interview Peter Ford said, "My father changed into exceptionally well known until he died. After which within months his name diminished from Hollywood conversations. Perhaps it turned into due to the fact Glenn by no means courted controversy, no scandals, no public meltdowns, no tragic cease. Like so many different icons, Glenn Ford left this world the equal way he lived in it, quietly, steadfastly and without begging to be remembered, and it is that very quality that makes him worthy of remembrance. Due to the fact his legacy doesn't lie in statues or ceremonies, it lives in each scene where he failed to act, however honestly existed, a lingering look, a confined line, a person who turned into by no means best but achingly, hauntingly actual. Glenn Ford never tried to turn out to be a legend, he didn't combat to be remembered, failed to step onto the degree to dazzle, and by no means used his ache to control public attention, and yet it really is precisely why he have become one of the hardest artists to neglect once you sit down quietly. An appearance behind the curtain, his life became a series of contradictions, between love and distance, between light and shadow, between the man trendy with the aid of the general public and the man his own family in no way completely understood. He loved one female for 40 years but could never marry her, abandoned his handiest toddler best to go back begging for forgiveness, whilst time turned into almost gone, reached the pinnacle of repute after which faded into obscurity without fanfare. Hollywood might also have forgotten his call. The movies that made him famous can also now sit in storage, but in case you've ever watched Gilda, ever been moved with the aid of his gaze in the large warmth, ever felt his presence in Blackboard Jungle, ever felt reassured seeing him as Superman's father, then you definitely already touched a bit of Glenn Ford's legacy, a legacy now not of titles, not of medals. You trust that legends like Glenn Ford, individuals who stayed true to themselves until the very quit, deserve to be remembered, understood and honored. Then proportion this tale. Have you ever seen a Glenn Ford film? What do you take into account about him? Leave us a remark so his name would not vanish into silence, and bear in mind to join our channel for extra, untold, unforgettable testimonies about the legends you love.